Ladies and gentlemen, there is further evidence that the Xbox One is indeed going to be having a slim model released at some point in the near future. Now this evidence is growing rather rapidly. Back in November 2014, I actually wrote an article which explored this evidence, and this was based on multiple sources, including a LinkedIn profile from Daniel McConnell, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, who is actually AMD's senior manager of SOCs. And in his LinkedIn profile, this post has since been nuked, unsurprisingly, it read, first APU for Microsoft's Xbox One game console in 28nm technology and a cost-reduced derivative in 20nm technology. This is also an article that I've written, this kind of an updated article, so you can check that out in the video description if you want links to all of the sources and some images and other bits and bobs throughout. But let's keep on, shall we? So, just so we're all on the same page, because I think that's quite important, the Xbox One's APU is obviously the package which holds the CPU, in other words AMD Jaguars, the GPU, which of course is based on AMD's GCN architecture, the ESRAM, the audio components, move engines, and various other parts which are pretty critical, to say the least, to make the Xbox One function and work. But anyway, Microsoft have since put some fuel on the fire, because, let's face it, people, kind of forget about this stuff, but recently fuel on the fire, because on their own official webpage, there's a link to that in the job description, it says, and I quote, that a successful candidate, this is for a senior electrical engineer, the candidate must demonstrate a solid understanding of core engineering principles, methodology, and loads of technical job requirements, which I'm not going to read out all of them, but also experience must include significant contribution to development of world-class consumer electronic products such as video game consoles, set-top boxes, desktop PCs, and laptop/tablet PCs. And another key point of the job description read, and I quote, specifying, designing, schematic capture, PCB layout, BOM, and cost analysis. Well, that's pretty important, right? And implementing and verifying electrical subsystems on the motherboard, as well as working with other engineers across disciplines to design, test, debug complex hardware technologies for product development to meet aggressive is important, and schedule goals. So in other words, that kind of lets you know quite a few things, because the main one here is the PCB, which is obviously the printed circuit board. In other words, the bit that all of the components sit on is, well, complete. If you were to look at your Xbox One and open it up, you're going to find a PCB in there. So in other words, this means that they're working on another iteration of that, and that tells you that this isn't just going to be the Xbox One that we currently have with a smaller APU, in other words, a die shrink. They're actually most likely going for a new unit. In other words, it's an Xbox Slim rather than the Xbox One that we've got, just with a reduced die, in other words, the 20nm APU. Now this ties in furthermore because in the article that we'd written last year, which is once again, that's linked in the article that's linked in the video description, we've got another key set of points, because there's yet another requirement which was for a job last year, and it says prior experience to debugging and bringing out memory subsystems, specifically familiarity with DDR3/DDR4, and experience with DRAM memory subsystems and DRAM memory training algorithms. Okay. You're thinking to yourself, well, how many more people can Microsoft actually employ? Well, a hell of a lot, actually. There's another recent job vacancy. Microsoft will probably be basically hiring pretty much half the people on the planet at this point. And they are seeking a CAD engineer. That's a computer-aided design engineer. And they are required, among other duties, to support PCB production, development for Xbox, the accessories, and connected development teams. But wait, there's more! Aren't you excited? You should be. There's also design implementation of PCs, motherboards, analog/digital circuit design, test vehicles, high-speed buses, PCIe, SATA, USB, DDR3/DDR4/GDDR5/hypertransport, etc., etc. are required. Layout design supporting various requirements. And I know this is getting ridiculous, but still, there's another job posting which wants an Xbox system engineer, which has skills in hardware and software engineering such as USB, SATA, PCIe, as well as various protocols, and experience in testing consumer electronics at the platform, product line, product, subassembly, and component levels. Finally, there's a position for a power supply verification, which is going to be basically design, verification, and qualification of the Xbox power supply. Okay, I'm going to take a breather, and by the power of the pause button, my breather is now complete. So what the hell does all of that mean? Well, two things. Firstly, the Xbox One's APU, as we've already discussed, it goes into further detail in the article, but suffice to say, the 20nm APU is going to require about 25% less power than the 28, which is obviously good. Microsoft could also theoretically increase the clock speed, although they probably won't for obvious reasons. So, in other words, you don't need the big power supply that's currently in there, because obviously if the APU is requiring less power, there's a very good chance that other components are also cost reduced as well, and power reduction as well. Therefore, less power consumption, therefore smaller power supply. Possibly an integrated power supply for the Xbox One. Who knows? So that means that they need a new power supply, and that means that they have a designer for that new power supply. Well, there are some other points. The Xbox One is not going bye-bye to the ESRAM. You know, don't expect to be seeing the ESRAM on a ship. Don't be expecting radical changes in the performance of the console. There might be slight differences. For example, and not too many people know this, but if you were to Google around on the PlayStation 2, there is actually a couple of different versions of the PS2 CPU. I don't remember the exact clock speeds are before anyone asks, but I believe one was like 290 something megahertz and one was around 298, 299. I'm really not going to fire up Wikipedia to check that out, but there is definitely a couple of different versions of the PS2 CPU. What does that mean? Well, on a very technical point of view, a few games do run actually a little bit better on the newer versions of the PS2, slightly less slowed down, and we are talking insignificant amounts of difference here, because they have a slightly higher clock CPU. That's very, very minor. But there's also a couple of differences with, I believe it was Genesis/Mega Drive processors, and primarily in their video outputs, the way they handle colour and stuff. From Model 1 to Model 2. That's just for your FYI, nothing particularly poignant to this, you might think, but it's possible we might see ever so slight differences in performance, very subtle. We are not talking that your current Xbox One is going to run something at 30 frames a second, and the new slim, shiny model, which is, you know, got pictures of unicorns on it, is going to be running at something at 60 frames a second at 4K. So don't be thinking that. It's possible that we'll be seeing a DDR memory being used in the Xbox One. It's not exactly likely, to be totally honest, because DDR4 memory, should I say, is quite expensive at the moment. And thus, why would they cost reduce by going to a new APU? Why would they cost reduce by going to Slim and so on, and then use DDR4? It's possible, however, in 12 months' time, prices will change, and let's be totally blunt, we don't know when this is going to happen. If you were to Google around for the Xbox 360's, you know, release schedule for when it put consoles out, you know, the initial console was released in like November 2005, which is when I first bought the console. Yay me for being an early adopter. I actually didn't get a RROD for quite some time. I believe it was like 2010, 2011, something along those lines. I remember I was raging internally because it happened just when Alan Wake came out, and I was swearing quite a bit. Actually, I have no idea when Alan Wake came out, but my Xbox lasted longer than some. I know some people have been for a couple of Xbox 360s by that point. Anyway, I digress. So what we're probably seeing here is, you know, an Xbox One is going to come out in a maybe Christmas, could happen slightly after Christmas, which would kind of make sense as well. Christmas would make sense this year because, well, they might want to spur sales, or they might be waiting till 2016, because 2016 is, once again, rumours, the date that Nintendo are supposedly going to be showing its console off. So if they have any sense, they will want to save something for when Nintendo show off their console. Because let's be honest, assuming Nintendo don't go and do something really silly, they're going to have a fairly powerful system. Because once again, according to the rumours, and you gotta love rumours because they sometimes contradict themselves, which makes them a friend. But the rumours are that, well, not even the rumours, AMD are supposedly working with Nintendo. Which isn't surprising given their history. If you look at the history of ATI and Nintendo, they're pretty close-knit. And in fact, AMD, I think, produced something else for them. IBM, however, produced the CPUs previously. But we don't know what Nintendo are using. They haven't confirmed, AMD haven't confirmed whether it's going to be x86 or whether it's going to be something different. To be totally honest, they've not even confirmed it is Nintendo. They've just said it's going to be a game console it's going to be used for, or something gaming related. And since Nintendo are saying, well, they're working on a new console, you can put 6 and 6 together. It usually comes up with 12, but it also could come up with 13. It could be someone else. Anyway, once again, I'm getting very off the beaten track here. So this looks, to me, like Microsoft are once again going for a cost-reduced system, which is really quite interesting, because you might remember from yesterday, I believe it was, unless my memory's bad. No, I believe it was yesterday. Microsoft are supposedly working on some secret projects where they're snapping up yet more talented individuals, for example, coders, for example, hardware designers, for example, testers, and all of the other, stuff, people you'd imagine, working on Kinect technology, as well as, and those duties are very broad. They are actually saying that they can't even tell you what they're working on unless you get the job, and then you've got to sign so many NDAs, your hand's probably going to fall off from your signature being wrote so many times. And suffice to say, those technologies they're saying are very experimental. In fact, they even warn that they might fail on some of the ideas they've got, but some of those are AI. Some of those are advanced motion tracking. Some of those are actually sounding kind of cool. And when one considers that Kinect is going to be, part and parcel of Windows, and we're hearing rumours of Cortana, and another fact as well, another factoid, if you will, you might recall that back when the SDK for the Xbox One got leaked, and I did like a massive analysis on some of the facts of the SDK. I still need to do a whole bunch more, I haven't forgotten, don't worry. But you might recall that we did this massive article that was going through all of the current details we have regarding the CPU core allocation and the way that the Xbox One's OS is working right now. That was just a couple of days ago. It's currently on Red Gaming Tech Facebook. Is on the Facebook, it's linked there, you can Google it. It's also linked in the article that's linked in this video description, so you can check that out if you so desire. But that is where Microsoft freed up a 7th CPU core for games developers. So in other words, previously 2 cores were off limits to game code. They were literally available for Kinect only and for basic OS functionality, whatever that is. However, Microsoft changed that. They've changed the way the system works. Now, custom voice functionality, it's not system stuff. So where you say Xbox record that, we're talking, if you say fire the meteor in the game, instead, that won't work anymore. If developers decide to opt to utilize, that CPU portion for the game code, and in addition to that, it will also work and give them extra memory bandwidth as well. I'm hearing about 1 GB per second, which doesn't sound like much, but it's still quite a bit. It's actually about a 68th of the total memory bandwidth that's available on the Xbox One, if we're referring just to DDR3, and obviously we're not counting ESRAM here anyway. So it's quite an interesting situation Microsoft have gotten themselves into, and I for one welcome this. I want to see what Microsoft are going to do. I would love to see a cost-reduced Xbox One. I would like to see. Here's what I'd like to see. Dream scenario. I would like them to release it with some killer games, like a ridiculously good package, a cheap Xbox One. Maybe £200, maybe slightly cheaper if they can. Obviously, I'm just throwing out numbers here, and it depends when it's released and how cheap they could actually make it. But if they could do that in time for, a good buying period, and they could do that with a couple of really good games on offer, I could see them really making a compelling case to buy the Xbox One, especially if they can once again innovate with some other components. Now, while I haven't mentioned the PlayStation 4 in this in terms of its die shrink, it's really pretty certain that Sony aren't just sitting on their hands and saying, hey, I like the PlayStation 4, me. I think it looks good how it is. They're probably also deciding, hey, let's figure out how we can improve things. What I'd like to see with both consoles is the ability to, particularly the Xbox One obviously, is to make it really easy to change a hard drive, and to basically just improve the GUI. I think the OS is pretty solid on both of them now, so I think it's more iterations. Obviously both teams are working really well on the SDKs. I have to say, I've got to give Microsoft props. Even reading over the leaked documents that I have and kind of doing quite a bit of technical analysis and just listening to what developers have said on Twitter and just in person, it's very evident Microsoft have, for lack of a better word, eaten some humble pie, said, hey, we kind of screwed up with the SDK and APIs at the start. It was pretty much, you know, you could just tell that just by reading any interview. People said, this is hideous. What did you do? There were massive issues with the profiling tools. There were issues with being able to access the resources and so on. And a lot of the potential for the system was cordoned off with the Kinect, and obviously they've kind of reduced that over time. So what I'm basically saying is the Xbox One is becoming a lot better as a system. I think now the problem Microsoft have got is they obviously need to start pushing the system to become cheaper. They need a good set of games, which they are starting to work on. And a lot of these, you know, changes they can make over a period of time. And so it would be kind of cool if they could release a cost-reduced system, maybe make it cheaper than the PlayStation 4. I'm not saying they'll be able to, but it's possible. We don't know what they're going to be doing. And there's some other theories as well that I go into further in the articles that I've mentioned, but maybe they're going to be using low-power DDR3. It's possible they likely won't be using GDDR5 because there's absolutely no reason for them to. Maybe GDDR3, maybe, but I don't know. I think it would make more sense in many ways for them to go with LPDDR3. That's usually used for tablets and so on and other low power devices, which would definitely go hand in hand with what they're trying to achieve. I'm guessing. I mean, I'm not a fly on the wall in Microsoft. I don't know exactly what they are, but if you read between the lines of the job descriptions, if you look at what Microsoft are kind of doing in the background, it would make some sense, right? Well, at least I think so. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video, my good friends. Take care. If you can use the, the like button, or click something anyway, and comment or give me your thoughts and opinions on this one. Subscribe would be amazing. I will give you internet cookies, many internet cookies. And I will see you soon. Take care and bye for now.